Hello and welcome back. I'm really excited about this week because we'll be debating universal basic income, also referred to as UBI. This is an interesting debate because it's so polarizing. Most people either love the idea or they hate it. Whether or not they love UBI or hate it appears to depend on their political views, although that's a bit of a misleading statement, as you'll soon learn. UBI is essentially a Keynesian wealth transfer program whereby the government collects taxes from individual earners and corporations and then redistributes the money equally among all citizens of a country or a region. Is this kind of wealth redistribution a good idea or a bad idea? What would be its impact on economic growth? Is UBI necessary because of recent economic trends towards automation and machine learning? What does UBI mean for the future of work? I don't have all the answers for you, but I can certainly outline the key contours of this debate so that you can decide for yourself. You ready? All right, let's do it. What is universal basic income? Before I define UBI, I should say that no state has ever actually implemented UBI. At the moment, it's just an idea that has floated around here and there, but at a national level, no country's ever implemented this kind of wealth redistribution policy. A few cities and regions within states, like Finland and the Netherlands, have experimented with UBI, but no entire country has ever gone so far as to disperse UBI. Yet. And I stress the word yet because many UBI proponents say that it is inevitable. In short, UBI can be defined as a wealth transfer program, different from the modern welfare state, where the state guarantees a sum of money to each and every citizen, regardless of their socioeconomic status. The amount of money could be enough for one to survive, but that's probably it. Recipients could then choose whether they want to work. If they don't work, they may still manage to survive on the payment itself, but if they want more than just survival out of life, then they can supplement their UBI payments with paid work. But isn't that just the same as welfare? Well, no, not exactly. The modern welfare state emerged post-World War II in light of Keynesian economics. The key idea underlying the work of John Maynard Keynes is that government should intervene in the economy by taxing individuals and corporations and then redistributing that money to create further demand for products and services. In effect, this taxation policy was based on the logic of redistribution of wealth from the haves to the have-nots, thereby preventing wealth from accumulating in the hands of the rich. The welfare state is one in which typically only disadvantaged people receive welfare payments. So if you're unemployed or disabled or you lack the requisite skills to compete successfully in the labor market, you get a welfare payment that will ensure that you and your family don't starve. Welfare as it exists today is means tested, meaning that it excludes most of the working and middle classes and virtually all of the upper class. With UBI, everyone is entitled to a payment, even rich people. Isn't it unfair that wealthy people should receive UBI? Well, that's the million-dollar question now, isn't it? What is fair? What does fairness mean? Is fairness the same as equity and equality? On its face, UBI seems at the same time very fair and very unfair. I guess it depends on your point of view. It's very fair in the sense that no one is excluded from the payment. Every citizen or legal resident of a state is, at least in theory, entitled to UBI. It doesn't matter what your race, your gender, educational status, or class is. In this sense, UBI epitomizes equality. What could be more equal than everyone receiving the exact same benefit? But from another point of view, it's often perceived as very unfair. That is to say, why should wealthy people who can clearly take care of themselves and their families be entitled to a state living subsidy? Shouldn't welfare payments be reserved exclusively for those who need them? So it's not entirely clear whether UBI is fair or unfair, and I guess you'll just have to decide on your own. Why would we ever implement UBI? Good question. So some scholars have argued that UBI is inevitable. In other words, regardless of how you feel about the policy, that is to say, whether it's fair or unfair, all states will eventually have to implement UBI payments. The reason lies in the nascent technological changes to the economy. Think about what's happening before our very eyes. Work that used to be done by humans is increasingly being done by machines. Automation is costing people their jobs. A good example would be truck drivers, the majority of whom, of course, are men. As we move towards self-driving vehicles, that role will eventually just disappear. Where will all those truck drivers then be redeployed? To factories? Probably not, since most factories these days are so automated that they require very little low-skill human input. So what's happening is that there are fewer and fewer jobs, leaving huge swathes of the economy unemployed or underemployed with no real work opportunities. UBI will enable them to live. It will enable them to shop, and it will provide them with something of a safety net. What are the advantages of UBI? Obviously, the answer to this question depends on who you ask. The supporters of UBI point to some moral advantages. No one will go hungry. Everyone will be able to afford to pay the rent, but there are also economic advantages as well. So supporters of UBI point out that wealth redistribution encourages economic growth, whereas before UBI, you have an army of essentially unemployed people with no money in their pockets. After UBI, every citizen will still get to go shopping, even if only for a limited number of goods and services. This is a very Keynesian argument, as I've said. Wealth redistribution ensures that wealth is put in the hands of those who will actually spend it. Another advantage that supporters point to is that UBI will create a more entrepreneurial and artistic society. So as long as our basic needs are taken care of, we can afford to create art or even start our own businesses to supplement the UBI. In short, the proponents of UBI argue that it will make everyone freer. But what are the disadvantages of UBI? Again, the answer to this question depends on who you ask. So the opponents of UBI raise a number of concerns. Some argue that it's not fair, as we've alluded to above, that people who are already reasonably well off should be entitled to any wealth transfer payments. Ultimately, it depends on how we define well off. I mean, how much wealth is enough for one individual or one family? Others argue that UBI is too akin to socialism and that it would therefore destroy the free market, which is responsible for virtually all of the technological advances that got us into this mess. From this point of view, opponents argue that too many UBI recipients would simply sit around and do nothing positive for society. I mean, why work when the state will just take care of you? Think about it for a second. Would you stop working if you had just barely enough to live on? Is UBI just a left-wing pipe dream? Well, I would say no, and that's what's interesting about UBI. It attracts people on the political left as well as people on the political right. So left-wing progressives will extol the collective benefits of UBI. No one will go hungry, no one will be homeless. When an individual loses his or her job, then he or she will have this buffer period, thereby reducing the economic anxiety associated with unemployment. But those on the political right have also voiced support for UBI. The libertarian Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman was a big proponent of UBI in the form of a negative income tax, which is actually slightly different from UBI, but similar. So a negative income tax ensures that people who work will always make more money than people who don't work. So right-wing proponents of UBI point out that the current welfare state essentially entrenches poor people. So when someone on welfare gets a job, they lose their welfare payment, and so they're not motivated to go back to work. Under UBI, everyone gets the same payment regardless of whether they choose to go back or not. I'm not sure whether I can support UBI or not. Can you provide me with more information? Well, ask and you shall receive. We're only getting started here with the UBI debate. This lesson has given you a basic overview of UBI. Next, I'd like you to listen to a podcast with a leading UBI expert with whom I've sat down. And here we'll be able to tease out some of the key debates in this area. After the podcast, I will provide another lesson that looks more deeply at the economics of UBI, but don't worry, I've designed that economics lecture for a non-technical audience. By the end of this week, I expect that you'll have not only a strong understanding of UBI, but hopefully a clearer view on where you stand in relation to this debate. This is Professor Andrew R. Timming signing out.